The Black Death was the largest plague pandemic that swept through Europe from 1347 to 1353. Historians are drawn to this event because it is essentially the deadliest, most apocalyptic and devastating pandemic humanity has ever seen, both in terms of the percentage of lives lost and the sheer number of casualties. During those years, Europe experienced the largest infection catastrophe in its history, with a death toll equivalent to hundreds of nuclear explosions in Hiroshima. It plunged medieval metropolises, towns, and villages into a reality akin to modern, post-apocalyptic sci-fi movies. Today, we'll discard all modern judgments and witness the arrival of a mysterious, nameless disease that changed the life of the medieval world. What rumors circulated in Europe before the pandemic arrived? Who first brought the plague to the Mediterranean? And what measures did the biggest cities take to try to avoid catastrophe? We'll discuss all this in this video. Not long ago, we ourselves witnessed a global pandemic, that of COVID-19, also known as the coronavirus. Living in the information age, we tracked its spread on interactive maps and received updates about the disease in mere minutes. In the Middle Ages, information traveled slower, at the speed of ships by sea and horses by land. The interactive map in this video will reflect what a resident of a medieval city in the mid-14th century might have known. This is how we'll trace the spread of the plague. It's commonly believed that the population of medieval Europe was largely uneducated and the peasants never left their villages while townspeople rarely left the city walls. But the very fact of a widespread pandemic disproves this myth and clearly demonstrates the mobility and communication typical of various social classes in Europe. When we think of travel in the medieval world, we usually picture merchants, seafarers, and soldiers. But traveling was also common among the vast bureaucracy of European states. Diplomats, judges, inspectors, chancellors, notaries, missionaries, coroners, and others. And that's now the end of medieval mobility. There was once more form of travel that united all the aforementioned professions, and even those who didn't need to travel for work, such as craftsmen, peasants, and even serfs, pilgrimages. We tend to think pilgrimages in the Middle Ages were undertaken only by religious fanatics walking long, dangerous roads to Jerusalem, but that's not entirely true. A pilgrimage was simply a journey to a holy place, and there were many of those across medieval Europe. People from all classes and backgrounds gathered in groups and regularly, some once a month, others every few years, set out to visit holy places, which could be located hundreds of kilometers away or just few hours' walk into a neighboring land. Beyond spiritual reasons, believers undertook pilgrimages to see something new, socialize, exchange experiences and news, and buy souvenirs like cool lead badges or bottles of holy water. Essentially, pilgrimages can be seen as an early form of tourism. The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, by the way, is a collection of stories about such a pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, where a group of tourist pilgrims from different professions entertain each other on the road by telling funny and even lewd tales. Taverns near holy sites bustled with visitors in the evenings, turning into a kind of news exchange hub where merchants would share the latest happenings of the wider world with peasants and craftsmen. In the early 1330s, stories of great misfortunes in Asia began spreading through Europe. These rumors were brought by merchants traveling along the Silk Road. At first, the news spread via letters exchanged among residents of large cities. Later, it reached provincial towns, where it was passed on by word of mouth among pilgrims, who then carried it into castles and villages. Reports spoke of massive environmental disasters in China. Some provinces were said to suffer from long torrential rains followed by terrible droughts. In others, swarms of locusts reportedly darkened the sun. Accounts also told of the earth shifting under China, with entire villages disappearing into cracks and chasms. An earthquake destroyed an entire Chinese city and toppled mountains, in whose place a lake 400 kilometers long was formed. On the coast of the South China Sea, residents reportedly heard ominous underground thunder. These catastrophic tales sparked concern in the West. Ludwig Heiligen, a musician and close friend of writer Francis Petrarch, while staying in the papal residence in Avignon, heard shocking information from travelers and immediately wrote about it to his friends in Flanders. In a certain province in eastern parts near Greater India, terrible events and unheard-of tempests overwhelmed that whole province for 3 days. On the first day, it rained frogs, serpents, lizards, scorpions, and many venomous beasts of that sort. On the second day, thunder was heard, and lightning flashes mixed with hailstones of marvelous size fell upon the land, which killed almost all men from the greatest to the least. On the third day, there fell fire together with stinking smoke from the heavens, which consumed all the rest of men and beasts and burned up all the cities and castles of those parts. On account of these calamities, the whole province was infected, and it is conjectured that the whole seacoast and all the neighboring lands were contaminated from the infection through the fetid breath of the wind blowing southwards from the plague regions. In the Middle East, Arab merchants were saying that a terrible plague had appeared in the mysterious land of darkness and had been carried by strong winds into the territories of India, China, and Mongol Empire. One of the first cities to receive reports from Asia was Venice, a trading post at the mouth of the Don River, known at the time as the starting point of the overland road to China. The city was under Genoese control and part of their network of colonies in the northern Black Sea region. In 1343, after decades of economic and religious tension between Genoa and the Mongol Empire, conflict finally broke out, beginning in Venice. A fight broke out in the marketplace between Italian merchants and local Muslims, which escalated into a serious clash. When Khan Janibek heard that a Muslim had been killed in the streets of Venice, he marched on the city with his army and laid siege to it. The Italian garrison held out bravely, but eventually their strength was exhausted. Merchants and soldiers fought their way back to the harbor and fled by ship to the fortress city of Caffa. Mongol horsemen immediately pursued them overland and soon laid siege to Caffa as well. The siege, which lasted over a year, was unsuccessful. Caffa was well supplied by sea, and the Italians launched counter-attacks inflicting heavy losses on the Mongols. Janibek lifted the siege, only to return a year later and resume the blockade. Again, the siege was ineffective. A proper naval blockade could not be established, and the city continued to receive food and arms by sea. But in the second year of the siege, newly arrived reinforcements brought with them a disease that spread rapidly through the Mongol army, decimating their ranks. Mongol shamans were powerless to stop the spread of the unknown pestilence. As Janibek's army thinned out and panic set in, he realized that taking the city by force was impossible. In a grim move, the Khan ordered the bodies of his dead soldiers, who had died from the mysterious disease, to be catapulted into the city using siege engines. A possible witness, the notary Gabriele de Musis, recounts this event in his memoirs. The Tatars ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone in sight. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them. Also, they dumped as many of their bodies as they could in the sea. And soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Moreover, one infected man could carry the poison to others and infect people and places with the disease by look alone. Not one knew or could discover a means of defense. A new, apocalyptic and deadly disease rapidly weakened the defenses of Caffa, but Genoa lacked the forces for a final assault. In the spring of 1347, the siege was lifted and peace was signed. As soon as sea travel became safe again, dozens of ships departed the city. Some carrying full cargo holds of various goods, and others packed with hundreds of people fleeing the horrible death. With the blockade lifted, merchants also began arriving at the city, hoping to profit from the sale of scarce goods after the long siege. Unaware of the threat posed by the raging disease, Italian sailors interacted with the local population and then returned to their ships sailing on toward Constantinople. To disembark passengers, trade and replenish supplies, sailors made regular stops at ports along the western Black Sea coast. The residents of these trading towns, unaware of the danger, allowed sailors to offload corpses from their ships and willingly traded with them. Within just a few weeks, half of the population of those towns would perish. By early June 1347, the first ships from Caffa began to approach Constantinople. The residents of the Byzantine capital had no reason for concern, as news and rumors usually arrived via Genoese merchants from the north. But this time the ships brought death. People who greeted the Genoese at the docks were suffering from unbearable headaches the very next day. Fever appeared, followed by weakness, coughing, or vomiting blood. Entire families and neighborhoods fell in within days. People were dying within a few days of the first symptoms. Doctors had never encountered anything like this before, and their usual treatments for fever were completely ineffective. Everyone who visited or cared for the sick during the first week of the epidemic also fell ill and died. The disease quickly spread through the city and reached the imperial palace. Emperor John VI Cantacozanos, who witnessed the death of his courtiers and buried his own son Andronicus, would later leave a detailed description of the illness. So incurable was the evil. Strong and weak bodies were all similarly carried away, and those best cared for died in the same manner as the poor. Neither did the disease take the same course in all persons. Many were unable to resist, died the same day, a few even within the hour. The ill wanted to speak, but the tongue was hard to move, and sputum suffused with blood was brought up, and disgusting and stinking breath from within. The throat and tongue were congested with blood. Great abscesses were formed on the legs or the arms, from which, when cut, a large quantity of foul-smelling pus flowed. There was no help from anywhere. If someone brought to another a remedy useful to himself, this became poison to the other patient. Most terrible was the discouragement. Whenever people felt sick, there was no hope left for recovery, but by turning to despair, adding to their prostration, they died at once. Large crowds of noisy refugees flooded the roads leading westward. Every day, church bells rang in alarm. Only a few weeks remained from the arrival of the Genoese ships before absolute silence would descend upon the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Genoese merchants who had stayed in Constantinople for just a few days departed and set course for Genoa. Many other merchant ships entered the port of Byzantium and left already as potential carriers of death. Some of them headed towards the Near East. The Genoese ships sailing along the coastline and stopping in the ports of Greece were on their way to Sicily. Through this route, the terrible disease entered medieval Europe. Upon arriving in the city of Messina, the sailors unloaded corpses and asked for help for the sick. The local residents rendered assistance and traded carefree with the Genoese until they themselves suddenly began to fall ill and die. The Sicilian monk Michele da Piazza wrote in his chronicle, "It so happened that in the month of October in the year of our Lord 1347, around the first of that month, 12 Genoese galleys put into the port of the city of Messina. They brought with them a plague that they carried down to the very marrow of their bones, so that if anyone so much as spoke to them, he was infected with a mortal sickness which brought on an immediate death that he could in no way avoid. The aforesaid pest appeared in such strange there that not only the pustules, which are called in the vulgar tongue anthrachy, but also certain glandular swellings arose on various members of the body, now on the groin, others on the legs, arms, and on the throat. They weakened and assaulted the human body to such an extent that it no longer had the power to stand up, but lay prostrate on the bed, burning with a high fever and downcast from a deep depression. Whereupon these glandular swellings grew to the size of an ant, then to the size of a hen or a goose egg, and became quite painful. When the bloody sputum reached the throat from the infected lungs, that the whole human body was putrefying. After this putrefaction and deficiency of the humors, the victims gave up the ghost." The residents of Messina forced the Genoese to leave the city, but it was already too late. Within a few weeks, the disease reached Catania, Syracuse, and Palermo. The streets quickly emptied. The Sicilian authorities took no action, and the regent, Duke Giovanni, immediately fled from Catania in panic to live in the forest. By autumn of 1347, dozens of ships, mostly Genoese but not exclusively, sailed the Mediterranean with the sick and dead aboard. Most continued along their usual trade routes towards the western Mediterranean and Adriatic seas. Some ships wandered the seas like ghosts with no living or healthy sailors left on board. News of the terrible disease being spread by merchant ships quickly circulated throughout Italy. Most port cities began to inspect incoming ships more carefully for sick or dead on board. The term Black Death appeared much later and only became commonly used in the 19th century. If you were living in, say, Florence in the year 1347, you and your friends would be discussing an unknown pestilence raging in Byzantium and southern Italy, using a phrase that would literally mean the great mortality. At the end of October 1347, a fleet of 3 or 4 infected ships, likely expelled from Messina, approached the city of Genoa. The city inspectors sailed out to meet them and denied entry when the sailors refused to show their cargo holds for inspection for diseased or dead. These galleys scattered in different directions, and one of them is known to have sailed toward Marseille. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, all quarantine measures were lifted and the iron chain that prevented ships from entering the port was lowered. The sailors came ashore freely. Within a week, dozens had died in the city, and the galleys was immediately expelled, sailing off toward the Atlantic. In December, another fleet approached Genoa, potentially carrying the disease. For unknown reasons, several ships were allowed to dock this time. As soon as dock workers and their families began falling ill, the city garrison was summoned and drove the ships away using flaming arrows and other war machines. The Great Death in Gulf Genoa. Crowds of people gathered at the northern gates of the city, desperate to flee. Written sources left accounts of the heroism of the city's notaries, who, despite the population dying out, continued working on legal documents to prevent total chaos. At the same time, the pandemic approached Venice. Unlike Sicily or Genoa, the city's response was better organized and focused on maintaining public order. Doge Andrea Dandolo appointed a special commission to oversee public hygiene. All arriving ships were thoroughly inspected, suspicious ones were burned. A 40-day rule was introduced. Unknown ships and even land traders had to spend 40 days in isolation near the city. If no illness manifested during this time, they were allowed to enter. Venice enacted a prohibition on alcohol and closed all taverns. A fleet of municipal gondolas appeared, patrolling the canals and collecting corpses from homes and streets. The city provided the dead with graves 1.5 meters deep and a final prayer from a priest. When daily deaths approached 600 per day, panic erupted in the city. Residents fled Venice en masse. But Doge Dandolo family stayed behind and issued an ultimatum to city officials. They had to return to Venice within 8 days or lose their positions. In central Italy, the disease began to spread via the fish market in the city of Pisa. Beyond this coastal city lay a dense network of rivers and large roads connecting trade routes from the sea to Tuscan towns and cities. In Florence, 81 kilometers east, the municipal government prepared for the arrival of the disease. Citizens were urged to keep homes and streets clean, and butchers were ordered to follow strict rules regarding the slaughter of animals. Similar measures were introduced in cities like Pistoia and Perugia, with large municipal funds spent on corpse disposal. Funeral bells were banned and restrictions were placed on burial processions. But the disease was relentless. According to chronicles, within months the populations of these cities would drop by nearly 90%. Two waves of the Grey Death, one from Marseille in January 1348 and the other from Genoa a month later, consumed Avignon, the city that housed the papal residents and attracted artists and scholars from across Europe. Strolling through the gardens of Avignon, one might meet many famous figures, such as the poet Petrarch, the painter Matteo Giovannetti, or a composer Philippe de Vitry. They all frequented the largest library in Europe and often visited the papal palace. Learning of the approaching Grey Death, Pope Clement VI held religious processions to appease God's wrath for humanity's sins. The renowned scholar surgeon and personal physician of the Pope, Guy de Chauliac, convinced Clement VI to stop mass gatherings and leave the city. The Pope relocated to the countryside and successfully survived all outbreaks. Guy de Chauliac and his colleague Gentile da Foligno stayed in the city and continued treating patients in hospitals and homes. Both contracted the plague, but only Chauliac recovered. He later wrote a detailed book describing the disease, its different forms, and his personal experience battling it. Today, it remains one of the most important works from that era, helping historians understand the nature of the pandemic. Thousands of pilgrims who visited Avignon during that period carried the disease deep into the continent. By spring 1348, the plague had struck the entire Mediterranean coast, the outskirts of Jerusalem, Tunisia, and the Iberian Peninsula. From the ports of western France, ships with pilgrims and goods carried the disease to major French cities such as Rouen, Caen, and Paris. The plague hit the University of Paris, killing many students and professors. Doctors across Europe were bewildered, as neither ancient or Arabic medical texts describe anything like this disease. King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty to write a treatise on a plague, which they did. 46 masters worked on a comprehensive report divided into two parts: one of the causes of the plague, the other on treatment and prevention. In this work, scholars attempted to rationally explain the causes and effects, relying on contemporary humoral theory and medical astrology. Though the text became popular among the intellectual elite, many scientists leaned toward a more naturalistic explanation, believing that poisonous air had been released from the earth due to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in Asia and Europe. Refugees and pilgrims from infected regions brought terrifying tales to the provinces of England and the Holy Roman Empire. These stories were filled with vivid descriptions of empty streets and the moans of hundreds dying inside houses. People stopped consuming imported Eastern spices and even fish, believing them to carry the infection. Merchants stopped traveling, and sailors refused to leave ports. In July 1348, the disease began devastating England. It was brought by ships from France, carrying English soldiers returning from the successful siege of Calais. The plague in England was the most thoroughly documented, with records from estates, abbeys and chancelleries reflecting mortality rates from 30 to 60%. In some places, documents captured the hopeless sense of an impending end of the world. For example, in the small village of Tilgersley, taxes could no longer be collected because all the residents had died. In the neighboring settlement of Woodington, only 2 tenants remained, and an agreement had to be made with them so they wouldn't leave. In the university town of Oxford, 3 mayors died in succession. The university declined so much that there was simply no one left to guard it. It also worth mentioning the mass die-off of animals. A random European official traveling from city to village observed thousands of scattered carcasses of sheep and cattle across the vast fields. In the cities, the bodies of ducks, cats, chickens and oxen lay everywhere. Residents saw the same buboes on these animals as on humans. Arab chronicles even left accounts of hundreds of dead lions, camels, boars and hares strewn across the steppes. Between 1349 and 1350, the Grey Death engulfed the entire territory of Central Europe, eventually reaching Poland. The Polish chronicler Marcin Kroma wrote about this. A severe pestilence, as we say as the vernacular and the Greeks call epidemics, spread all over Poland for 2 years, so that the countryside as well as the towns are left empty of people. Not only Poland was afflicted at this time, but it spread over almost all the lands of the world. Italy, Germany or Gaul are affected and deprived all their resources. Ships brought the plague to all major port cities of Northern Europe, and in the same year the Grey Death reached Sweden and Norway. From there, it spread to the shores of the Teutonic Order, to the trading stations of Danzig and Königsberg, and from there moved to the lands of France. Evidence of this can be found in the Nikon Chronicle under the year 1352. By God's will, death among people is hard, terrible, and in vain. From the harvest festival to Easter, countless good people shall die. This will happen not only in Novgorod, but spread across all lands. That same summer, there was a strong pestilence in Smolensk, and in Kiev, and in Chernihiv, and in Suzdal. Across all the land of Rus, death was fierce, senseless, and swift. And there was great fear and dread among all people. In Hluchiv not a single person remained, all were dead. The same was true for Belozersk. These short lines convey the despair that gripped the lands of Rus in the mid-14th century. And while in Kiev this was the first wave of the unknown disease, in many Italian cities where it had all begun, the second or even third wave was already raging, coming after Zeus, who had managed to survive the terrible autumn of 1347. As with the coronavirus centuries later, the Great Death would return to Europe's cities again and again over the following years. A series of plague outbreaks would plunge the world into truly dark times, changing everything. The lives of those who survived, regardless of social status, would be forever split into before and after.